Hey friends, welcome to SvelteKit Endpoints. Today we're going to learn about SvelteKit Endpoints and when you should use standalone endpoints and when you should use page endpoints or cases for using them together. So let's get started. So first let's get reminded what are endpoints. So an endpoint is a way to interact with another machine on the internet that returns a specific HTTP response to a HTTP request. Let's say for example you wanted some placeholder images, in which case you could use the JSON placeholder API that provides some data using a fake REST API. So the URL for that would look like jasontypico.com/photos and it turns a JSON response as key value pair. So if we go to the API response, we can see it here, and I can even zoom in so you can see it better. So yeah, really nothing special, and as always this is just some JSON response you can consume on the front end and loop over it and display the placeholder images. Using a backend framework like Express, you can create an API endpoint where you can get data from anywhere and have complete control over what you return. So for example, here is a code example and I already have it here inside this Express folder. So here it's nothing special. I have just installed Express Node Fetch. If you're using an older version of Node, native API fetch support isn't supported. So if I just close this and open the code, we can see I import Express, I import Fetch, and we just really initialize Express, and then we just have the API here, and then we get the photos, and then we just get 100 results, right? So this is really awesome, and you might be thinking, why are you just returning the API response? And the answer is because now you have your own backend, you own it, right? So you can even parameterize these photos, as I mentioned in the post. So you can say, for example, photos $amount equals etc. And you can really build your own API around this or whatever you want, or you can do something else. Like for example, you're using an API for TV shows, and maybe you're making a TV show tracker, etc. So now you're building an entirely different thing on an existing API. And here I have it Express, so I just have to say node dot. This is going to start the index file. And then this should be at localhost 3000. And remember, it's photos, so we have to go to the same URL and then we have to say photos. And then we're going to return the JSON response, which looks like this. Yeah, so this really isn't that different than what we get from the JSON placeholder API, right? So that's really interesting. But yeah, let me just close this. So let's talk about SvelteKit endpoints. Instead of having a separate backend and frontend, SvelteKit combines them together into one cute package. So for example, instead of specifying a photos endpoint like in the Express example in SvelteKit, you can just create a photos.json.ts or JS if you prefer JavaScript file in your routes folder that becomes available at example.com/photos. And as explained in the documentation, endpoints are just modules written in JavaScript or TypeScript files that export request handler functions corresponding to HTTP method. So that is get, post, patch and delete and etc. This has multiple benefits, from being able to talk to a database or reading from a file system because it runs on the backend, which wouldn't be possible on the front end. And SvelteKit endpoints work by exporting request handler functions that correspond to HTTP request methods. So you can see here is an example of that. So you can export post, put, patch, delete, and etc. that has an event, and you can do whatever you want. So the job of this function is to return a response that includes the status, headers, and body of the response. And using a modern web framework like SvelteKit, your knowledge is transferable because you're going to spend more time learning web fundamentals on MDN than learning framework-specific abstractions. So let's talk about standalone endpoints. In SvelteKit, you can create a standalone endpoint like in the Express example that you can expose to the world or consume it yourself. So standalone endpoints can have an optional file extension like photos/index.json.ts, making it available at example.com, photos.json. And it could be also other things such as XML or even images, and this is neat because it can set the proper response headers for you. We're using something like photos/index.ts is directly available at example.com photos, but both methods are great, so there is nothing wrong with either one, and we're going to learn what's the difference, right? So let's look at the same Express example in SvelteKit. If I scroll over here, so on the side, I really have this SvelteKit folder, and here's nothing special. This is just a source folder. I have routes here. Here is a layout. It just has some styles, really isn't important. And if you want at the start of the post, I have a link to the repository, and you can even open it on StackBlitz and play around with it yourself. But yeah, let's just really start with the example. So we can create a photos folder, right? Just as we had it before. And then we can create, for example, index.json.ts. And then I can close this. Let me just copy the code over. Yeah, and that's really it. So this really isn't anything special. And let me just open the prettier file. And we're going to say the print width should be 60, just so you can see everything. And really nothing special. This is the same thing as before, as you see in the Express example. So if I start this up, we can go to SvelteKit and we can just say npm run dev. But of course, if you're using npm, it's the same. Yeah, so we can go here at localhost 5173. The new port is really awkward. Yeah. Or you can just open it, and I have nothing here, but if you go to photos, you're going to see the same response. If you go to photos.json, that is. Yeah, and you can see that this is really the same, what we've seen before, right? So let me just close this terminal because we don't really need it. But yeah, now we have that. So anyone can use the API at example.com/photosjson if that's what you want, but we can also consume it on the front end using the load function that runs before the page is created and returns the page props. So in SvelteKit, pages are just components, so we need to somehow run the data before the page or component is initialized, so we can server-side render it, etc. And also just personal preference. If we go here, we can just, not like this, I can go semi, go say false, and here's an extra tip. Now that we can stop this, and we can run npm run format, and this is going to lint all of your files. Yeah, and then just let's run development, close this, boom, bam, thank you, ma'am, and this is it. But yeah, so now for example, if we have this file, let me just copy over the code, where we consume the API. So inside the photos folder, we can create an index.svelte. Let me just close this file, and I'm going to copy it over. So the types, if you're interested, come from here, types, which really isn't important. If you don't care about TypeScript, that's fine, because it's really optional. And I'm just going to close this, going to save everything. And now, if we go to photos, because that's our URL, right? Now we should get some photos, which is really awesome. And also let me open the network tab so you can see what's going on. And let me just see everything is all right here. Yeah, so that looks perfectly fine. Let me just move this over. So you can go back to the post, and really nothing special. Here is our load function. So here we import the types. Here's the load function. So we're just fetching our own endpoint, which is fine because we might be using this in other pages. So this is really great. And then we get the photos from it and we return it as props. And inside the script tag, we expose it as props, and now we can loop over it, and we can even put prefetch on it, so it fetches all the data for the page in advance when you hover or click on the link, right? Which is really great, and it just displays it in a neat grid. And this is something that you would done in the past, maybe you're familiar with it, etc. But if you think about it, this is just really boilerplate because you already done this job once, so why are you doing it twice, right? So using load to fetch data from an external API is great, but we can't talk to the database or read from the file system because it runs on the server or client. So these are some drawbacks that you have to think about. And it's pure boilerplate, as I said, if you already wrote the same code inside a standalone endpoint. So let's talk about page endpoints. So in the previous example, we created a standalone endpoint that fetches some placeholder images and shows them when you visit the photos page. If your goal isn't to create a public-facing API to be consumed by multiple pages or sources, and the only thing that cares about the data is your page, then you should use a page endpoint. So here I have a nifty diagram. So the SvelteKit Endpoints guide, do multiple pages use the data? Yes, then use a standalone endpoint. And here's an example where you have the same photos JSON API, right, and multiple pages can consume it or whatever else source. And if the answer is no, then use a page endpoint. So you have /photos, and then you're just going to fetch that for the page, and that's all you need, right? And the only change you have to do is rename the index.json.ts file to index.ts to convert a standalone endpoint to a page endpoint and remove the redundant boilerplate code from index.svelte, right? Yeah, so if we look at here, let's go open our sidebar, and we just have to rename this folder from index.json.ts to index.ts. Yeah, just like that. And we can go here, let me just move it to the side. because it's just boilerplate, right? We already done this job once, so there's really not a need to do it anymore. So we can really delete this code and look how much nicer it is. And let me just look. Yeah, this is it. And it should work the same, right? If we go to photos and if I refresh for good measure, I'm going to disable the cache. Let me just hide this so we have more room. And yeah, here are our placeholder images and everything is working great. So now instead of having a load function where we return props, anything you return inside the body here is going to get turned into page props. And you can even return errors and etc. this way, but that's really a topic for another video, right? So as you see, here is the example. We just removed the code from above and everything is great. So this is really awesome, but this is just the start of it. Page endpoints are powerful because they enable progressive enhancement for forms, because now your form has its own endpoint among other things. So this is just an example because forms deserve their entire separate video. So if you want to play around with this, you can open the SvelteKit default example. When you start a new SvelteKit project, you can play around with this where you have the progressive enhancement example with the to-do list. So if I just show it here, for example, in this example, we just have a form and then we import the enhance form action from actions form, let's say, for example, and then we use it here, use enhance form where the method is post, and we don't really even have to define the action attribute on the form because it shares the same endpoint, right? So how awesome is this? So if the JavaScript on the page fails for whatever reason, it's going to work the same, which is awesome because it's just going to use the regular endpoint. And if JavaScript is available on the page, it's going to use progressive enhancement and it's going to use the action and it's going to do what you would do by default. It's going to prevent default and really do the equivalent of calling an onSubmit function, right? So this is really awesome. And here in the endpoint is the example. You can get inside your page endpoint post request, right? So you can get the form await request.form data, and you can get the user thanks to the name attribute. So you can get it from user, and that's really awesome. So you can do whatever you want here and etc. So as I said, if JavaScript is available on the page, the form action is going to be used, but if JavaScript fails for whatever reason, it's going to work like a regular form. There are situations when you would want to use both together though. You learn when to use a standalone endpoint and a page endpoint, but sometimes you want to use both. So for example, I want to be able to show a single photo. So let me just close this and I'm going to close this. So to do that, we're going to go to the photos folder. We're going to create a parameter ID. So that's going to be our endpoint. Let's just copy over the code. And then we're going to copy over the markup. So we're going to create the same thing, ID Svelte. And if I mentioned it already, when you're creating a page endpoint, the file has to have the same name as your Svelte component or page, right? So that's how SvelteKit knows that it's a page endpoint. So here we have just a simple example. Here is our endpoint. Just move it over. Yeah, so here we're just calling the API, which is the param ID. So if I take this, I copy it over. So if I go, for example, here and I just say photos 1 or photos 2, we can now parameterize this and we can get the individual photo when we click on it. And since we have prefetching, it's going to start loading the data in advance. So yeah, so we return the photo back and then we can catch it in the component. So here is the photo using the type I showed you before. So we get the photo title, photo URL, and yeah, that's lovely. So now when we click on a photo, we should go to the individual photo. But there's one problem if you've noticed it. If I go here, when I press on a photo, pay attention, it happens quick, so maybe you're going to miss it. The photo is going to flicker because it's not loaded yet. Also, let me just clear this. And if I hover over this, you can see it flickers and then it loads the photo, right? So we can prevent this by using the load function. So you're thinking, how can we use both? And the answer is rather simple. We can pass the props from the page endpoint to the load function, and then from the load function we can load the image before the page is able to navigate, and that's how we can fix the flickering, which is really awesome. So in the post, I really show you this here, and here is the solution. So if we go to the photos id.svelte, we're in the same file, right? I'm just going to copy over this bad boy. Yeah, and then really this is nothing intimidating. This is just some couple of lines of code. So we can pretend, for example, that this is coming from some utils folder where we have load image TypeScript. And here is a function, asynchronous load image, that takes a source. It's just a promise that has a resolve reject. It creates a new image and then assigns it the image source right. And then we just add event handlers on top of it. We say image.onload, hey, resolve when it's loaded, so the page is going to navigate, otherwise it's going to block, so nothing is going to happen. And then on error, we're going to reject and show the user an error. And the rest really is the same. We're just checking if this is the browser. And then we call the function load image, props, photo, URL. And this is really awesome. So I can just close this. And to see this in action, let me just go back here and I'm going to refresh everything. And I'm going to clear. And instead of disabling the cache, because we really want this to be cached as the normal user would use the site, right? So we can do that. And now when I hover over the image, it should start load the image. So you can see inside our network tab, everything is already loaded. And now, of course, our user isn't going to hover like this for a minute. We can go to the image, and a more regular use case would be, let me just refresh again. And then our user is like, and what is this photo? Let me just click on this, and boom, it's like this. So yeah, if you go here, let me just do it again. This is already cached. This, we can go back here. We can go to another image, and this is going to only load when the image is loaded. So this is really awesome. I even mentioned this, and you can see this in the network tab, and now the flickering problem is solved. And I also want to show you another example that I use on this page itself. So another example I have for you is setting cache control HTTP headers for the page. So I made this mistake when I started learning this. I thought that setting the cache control headers here would set it for the page, but you have to remember this is your page endpoint, so you're just going to cache the data that you have here. So in this example where I have the endpoint, I'm just returning some data 1, 2, 3, 4, and I set the cache control where it's going to be fresh for 60 seconds, and this is going to get cached by your content delivery network, CDN, whatever. But this is not how you do it. So you would set the cache control header on the endpoint if you wanted to cache the endpoint. So you would, for example, do it like this, and then you would set it here. But this really isn't what we want, right? So we can go here, and then inside your load function where you have the props, yeah, here are the props already, right? So we have everything, right? Which is really awesome. So again, this comes from here, and then we can set the cache here. Where are your props? So let me just do it like this. Yeah, so we have props, and then you can set the cache. You can say max age 60 seconds again, and now this is going to cache your document. And I use this method for the page you're reading, and I encourage you to open the network tab if you aren't, and you can see it in action. So if we go here, and let me just open the network tab, and I can even refresh the post. And that was quick. So we can go to SvelteKit Endpoints, and then if we go to the headers, you see date, yeah, public max age 60, because it's a fresh post, and I even have it so that when the post is older than a week, then it should basically cache it forever. But Vercel unfortunately doesn't respect your cache control header, so the cache lasts at most a couple of hours. But yeah, that's a rant for another day. I hope you learned about the difference between standalone endpoints and page endpoints and know when to use each one or both if you need it. So thanks for reading, and catch you in the next one.